Family life is one family per house by late Iron Age. So it's mum, dad and kids, and perhaps an elderly relative or two, but certainly not aunts and uncles and brothers. Family sizes, 3 or 4 children surviving. Infant mortality is quite high, so they would probably have maybe 8 or 10 children, but only 3 or 4 actually survive. And they were quite often considered gifts from the gods, simply because it was a risky business having children and children surviving. Now the daily work would start with first thing in the morning, when grain would be brought from the granary, put in a pot near the fire to be parched. That means to be dried out. Whilst that was doing, the children would be sent out for fresh firewood for the day and of course water for the day. Once you've got your firewood in and your fresh water for the day, the first job is grinding. This means using querns, which are stones used for grinding the wheat down to make flour. It takes approximately an hour to an hour and a half to grind sufficient grain down to make flour for the daily bread. You get about a pound, pound and a half of flour in that time, and that will make you a couple of pounds of bread, and that will be for the day. The daily task for the men, of course, out on the fields, there would be herders of various kinds, depending on the season. Herding the animals out onto the pastures was quite often done by the older men, where the work is a little easier, where you just simply have to walk with the herds. Herds of cattle and herds of sheep particularly would go out onto high pasture during the summer. Children's jobs, once the firewood and the water is in, is helping to look after the animals. You would be hunting around for eggs. The hens would have been running loose and would have found quiet, secret places to lay their eggs, so the kids would have been following the hens and known where they were and periodically collected eggs. Other animals that would need tending would be like goats, for instance. They're usually kept close to the house, and the milk cows. The main group of cattle would be out on pasture, but the milk cows, of course, would be brought in on a daily basis. And from a very young age, probably no more than 4 or 5, the children would be taught how to milk a cow, and that would be one of their daily tasks. On a daily basis, those that were working on the farm, doing the building, doing constructions, looking after the crops, your meals would be breakfast, which was likely to be the leftovers from the night before. Lunch, you would perhaps take bread and cheese out into the fields with you, but the evening meal was usually at sundown. Most main meals are boiled meats with assorted vegetables or herbs that were seasonal. No potatoes, so you wouldn't have roast potatoes or crisps or anything like that. It would be a diet of fresh bread and boiled meats. The reason for boiling is very simple. It's far more economical on firewood. You can keep a large cauldron ticking over for a very long time with a very small amount of firewood. If you roast meat, it takes a lot of firewood, and that means more work to actually go and cut it and bring it in. So roasting tended to be kept for special occasions, for feasts and celebrations. Beer is brewed simply because drinking water, although relatively clean compared with modern times, by brewing beer, you actually sterilize the water. It's boiled and it's fermented, and that means it's under controlled circumstances. Evenings, depending on what time of year and how light it was, you would perhaps sit up and talk after an evening meal. Kids would be sent off to bed after they'd done their final chores. You would quite often get up with the sun as well, particularly during the summer. When the days are long and warm, there's a lot to do, but then it's the biggest production time of the year. It's the time when the animals are giving birth and you're raising the young animals, you're getting all your crops in. Weeding in the early stages of wheat, for instance, can increase the crop enormously. And towards the end of the summer, of course, very long days once the harvest starts. And everybody put their hands to the harvest. It was the most important time of the year. The wheat was harvested, brought in sheaves and stored. Once all the wheat was safely in, it would be thrashed. That means taking the grain out of the heads. The straw itself would be stored for thatching houses with. The grain itself would be winnowed and cleaned and put into granaries. That's for the feed that you eat during the year. Seed grain is kept in the ground, holes dug in the ground, the grain is put in and then a clay cap put over the top, creating a giant jam jar. And the grain is actually kept very safely over the winter and then taken out as seed grain the following spring. Winter time was much closer to home. Once the trees had dropped their leaves, you would go into the woodlands to work the woods. It's much easier to cut when there is very little water in the trees. So all your timber preparations were done in the autumn and winter. Your animals would be put over your fields after your crops. So for the 2 or 3 months after a crop had been taken off a field, you would be putting, first of all, your cows across it to graze what was possible. Sheep would go across to nibble it even closer, and then the pigs go across, and by the time they've finished, they've virtually ploughed it for you. So it actually saves you an enormous amount of work. The end of the winter, of course, you would take your ard, which is a very early type of plough, out onto the fields to turn the soil over before planting your wheats. The other thing during the winter, of course, is mostly done around the home, things like spinning and weaving. The wool that was taken off the sheep during the summer would have been stored. Over the summer and the autumn, the ladies in particular would have been spinning that on a daily basis. When they weren't doing any other chores, perhaps popping over to the neighbours and having a chat, they would be standing and spinning the wool into a thread, and that would be stored away. And then over the winter, a very long job setting up a loom and weaving the cloth.